2. On theoretical work, difficulties and resources. I would like to expound, in some rapid pages, some of the difficulties encountered by any work of theoretical exposition of Marxist principles, before proceeding to an inventory of the resources, some well known, others sometimes misunderstood, at our disposal. 1. Difficulties. Whatever the simplicity of its language and the clarity of its exposition, any Marxist theoretical treatise presents some specific and inevitable difficulties, inevitable because they pertain to the specific nature of theory or, more precisely, theoretical discourse. A difficulty of the terminology of theoretical discourse. Marxism is at once a science, historical materialism, and a philosophy, dialectical materialism. Scientific discourse and philosophical discourse have their own requirements. They use the words of everyday language, or composite expressions constructed with the words of everyday language, but these words always function otherwise than they do in everyday language. In theoretical language, words and expressions function as theoretical concepts. To be precise, this implies that the meaning of words in such a language is not fixed by their ordinary usage but by the relations between theoretical concepts within a conceptual system. It is these relations that assign to words, designating concepts, their theoretical meaning. The peculiar difficulty of theoretical terminology pertains, then, to the fact that its conceptual meaning must always be discerned behind the usual meaning of the word, and is always different from the latter. Now this difficulty is concealed for the unaware reader when the theoretical term purely and simply reproduces an ordinary term. For example, everyone thinks they immediately know what Marx means when he uses so ordinary a word as labor. Yet it requires a great effort to discern, behind the common, ideological, obviousness of this word, the Marxist concept of labor, or better still, to see that the word labor can designate several distinct concepts, the concepts of the labor process, labor power, concrete labor, abstract labor, etc. When it is clear, that is, when it is firmly fixed and well marked off, a theoretical terminology assumes the precise function of preventing confusion between the normal meaning of words and the theoretical, conceptual, meaning of the same words. It performs this role above all by forging composite expressions that prevent the ideological confusion, thus labor process, abstract labor, mode of production, relations of production, etc. In each of these expressions one finds only ordinary words, labor, concrete, abstract, mode, production, relations, etc. It is their specific conjunction that produces a new, precise meaning, which is the theoretical concept. Something can be obtained from a theoretical discourse only on condition that it produces these specific expressions, which designate theoretical concepts. This is why, on our own account, we have had to propose some new expressions, as and when necessary, to designate concepts indispensable to the definition of our object, for example knowledge effect, mode of theoretical production, etc. We have done this with the greatest care, but we had to do it. B. Difficulty of theoretical discourse. The terminological difficulty is itself only the index of another, more profound difficulty, which has to do with the theoretical nature of our discourse. What is a theoretical discourse? In the most general sense, it is a discourse that results in the knowledge of an object. At this point, in order to make what follows intelligible, we must offer a few clarifications, anticipating theoretical developments that will be published later. we shall say that, in the strong sense of the term, only particular real and concrete objects exist. At the same time, we shall say that the ultimate purpose of any theoretical discourse is concrete knowledge, Marx, of these particular real and concrete objects. This is the sense in which abstract history or history in general does not exist, in the strong sense of the term, but only the real, concrete history of those concrete objects that are the particular concrete social formations we can observe in the accumulated experience of humanity. It is in this sense that production in general, abstract production, does not exist, Marx, superscript 1, but only this or that concrete real conjunction combination of hierarchically structured modes of production in this or that determinate social formation. The France of 1848, Marx, the 18th Brumaire, class struggles in France, the Russia of 1905 or 1917, Lenin, etc. All knowledge, and hence any theoretical discourse, has as its ultimate goal the knowledge of these particular concrete real objects, either their individuality, the structure of a social formation, or the modes of this individuality, the successive conjunctures in which this social formation exists. However, and this is the decisive point, we know that knowledge of these particular, concrete, real objects is not an immediate given, nor a simple abstraction, nor the application of general concepts to specific data. These are the positions of empiricism and idealism. Knowledge of particular, concrete, real objects is the result of an entire process of production of knowledge, whose outcome is what Marx calls the synthesis of many determinations. This synthesis being the concrete knowledge of a concrete object. 1857 Introduction. What does this synthesis, as Marx calls it, consist in? And what are these determinations? This synthesis consists in the correct combination conjunction of two types of elements, or determinations, of knowledges, which, for the sake of clarity, we will for the moment call theoretical elements, in the strong sense, and empirical elements, or, in other terms, theoretical concepts, in the strong sense, and empirical concepts. Theoretical concepts, in the strong sense, bear on abstract formal determinations or objects. Empirical concepts concern the determinations of the singularity of concrete objects. Thus, we will say that the concept of mode of production is a theoretical concept which concerns the mode of production in general, an object which does not exist in the strong sense but is indispensable to the knowledge of any social formation, since every social formation is structured by the combination of several modes of production. In the same way, we will say that the concept of the capitalist mode of production is a theoretical concept, that it concerns the capitalist mode of production in general, an object that has no existence in the strong sense. In the strong sense, the capitalist mode of production does not exist, but only social formations dominated by the capitalist mode of production, but is nonetheless indispensable for the knowledge of any social formation characterized by the domination of what we call the capitalist mode of production, etc. The same goes for all Marx's theoretical concepts, mode of production, productive forces, or technical relations of production, social relations of production, the political instance, the ideological instance, the concept of determination in the last instance by the economy, the concept of the articulation of instances, the concept of social formation, the concept of conjuncture, the concept of practice, of theory, etc. These concepts do not give us concrete knowledge of concrete objects, but knowledge of the abstract formal determinations or elements, we will say objects, that are indispensable to the production of concrete knowledge of concrete objects. In saying that these are abstract formal objects, we are only noting the terminology used by Marx himself, who, in capital, engaged in abstraction and produced knowledge of forms and developed forms. For empirical concepts bear on the determinations of the singularity of concrete objects, that is, on the fact that such a social formation presents such and such a configuration, traits, particular arrangements, which characterize it as existing. Empirical concepts thus add something essential to concepts that are theoretical in the strong sense, precisely the determinations of the existence, in the strong sense, of concrete objects. It might be thought that with this distinction we have reintroduced, under the guise of theoretical concepts, something resembling empiricism, namely, empirical concepts. This term, which will be modified in subsequent works to avoid any ambiguity, must not lead us into error. Empirical concepts are not pure givens, not the pure and simple tracing, not the pure and simple immediate reading, of reality. They are themselves the result of a whole process of knowledge, containing several levels or degrees of elaboration. Of course, these empirical concepts express the absolute requirement that no concrete knowledge can do without observation, experiment, and the data they provide. This corresponds to the gigantic empirical research, bearing on the facts, of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and to the concrete investigations and inquiries that sustained every concrete analysis of a concrete situation for all the great leaders of the working class movement. But at the same time they are irreducible to the pure data of an immediate empirical investigation. An investigation or an observation is in fact never passive. It is possible only under the direction and control of theoretical concepts directly or indirectly active in it, in its rules of observation, selection, classification, in the technical setting that constitutes the field of observation or experiment. Thus, an investigation or an observation, even an experiment, first of all only furnishes the materials which are then worked up into the raw material of a subsequent labor of transformation that is finally going to produce empirical concepts. By empirical concepts, then, we do not mean the initial material but the result of successive elaborations, we mean the result of a process of knowledge, itself complex, wherein the initial material, and then the raw material obtained, are transformed into empirical concepts by the effect of the intervention of theoretical concepts, present either explicitly, or at work within this transformative process in the form of experimental settings, rules of method, of criticism and interpretation, etc. 5 In no case is the relation of theoretical concepts to empirical concepts a relation of exteriority. Theoretical concepts are not reduced to empirical data, or a relation of deduction. Empirical concepts are not deduced from theoretical concepts, or a relation of subsumption. Empirical concepts are not the complementary particularity, the specific cases, of the generality of theoretical concepts. Rather, it should be said, in a sense close to Marx's expression when talking about the realization of surplus value, that empirical concepts realize theoretical concepts in the concrete knowledge of concrete objects. The dialectic of this realization which has nothing to do with the Hegelian concept of the speculative realization of the idea in the concrete, will obviously demand sustained clarification, which can be produced only on the basis of a theory of the practice of the sciences, and of their history. Be that as it may, We can say that the concrete knowledge of a concrete object indeed appears to us as the synthesis of which Marx spoke, a synthesis of the requisite theoretical concepts, in the strong sense, combined with elaborated empirical concepts. There is no concrete knowledge of a concrete object without the necessary recourse to the knowledge of those specific objects that correspond to the abstract formal concepts of theory in the strong sense. For the moment, these specific points suffice for introducing an important distinction between the possible objects of a theoretical discourse. If we retain the distinction just advanced between abstract formal objects and concrete real objects, we may say that a theoretical discourse can, according to its level, bear either on abstract and formal objects, or on concrete and real objects. For example, the scientific analysis of a concrete historical reality, the French social formation in 1966, will indeed constitute a theoretical discourse in the general sense, since it provides us with a knowledge. But in that case, it will be said that the discourse concerns a real concrete object. On the other hand, Marx's Capital does not analyze a social formation, a real concrete society, but the capitalist mode of production. It will be said that it concerns a formal or abstract object. We can conceive of a large number of theoretical discourses bearing on formal or abstract objects, on the concept of mode of production, for example, or on the instances that constitute a mode of production, economic, political, ideological, or on the forms of transition from one mode of production to another, etc. A discourse on the general principles of Marx's theory also bears on a formal or abstract object. It does not treat some concrete object, this social formation, that conjuncture of the class struggle, but the principles, i.e. the theoretical concepts, of Marxism, formal abstract objects. If all discourses that produce knowledge of an object can be called, in general, theoretical, we must accordingly make a very important distinction between discourses concerning real concrete objects, on the one hand, and discourses concerning formal abstract objects, on the other. It will be helpful to designate as theoretical discourse, or theory in the strong sense, discourses bearing on formal abstract objects. This distinction is necessary. On the one hand, the first kind of discourse, concrete, presupposes the existence of the second, abstract. On the other, the scope of the second kind of discourse, abstract, infinitely exceeds the object of the first kind. This is quite clear in the case of Marx's theoretical discourse in Capital. The theory of the capitalist mode of production, a formal abstract object, theory in the strong sense, in fact permits knowledge of a great number of real concrete objects, in this case knowledge of all social formations, all real societies, structured by the capitalist mode of production. On the other hand, the concrete knowledge of a real object does not ipso facto allow knowledge of another real object unless one makes recourse to the theory, in the strong sense, of the capitalist mode of production, that is, unless one extracts from the first concrete knowledge the abstract knowledge at work therein. From these remarks, difficult, to be sure, but clear, I hope, we can draw two conclusions. First, that a discourse on the general principles of Marxism is, in its very limits, a theoretical discourse in the strong sense, since it does not address some real concrete object, for example the class struggle in France, or the history of the cult of personality, etc., but a formal abstract object, the fundamental principles of Marxism, considered independently of any real concrete object. Second, that the specificity of theory in the strong sense is precisely to be concerned with a formal abstract object or objects, that is, not to produce concrete knowledge of real concrete objects, but knowledge of formal abstract or theoretical objects, in the strong sense, of concepts of theoretical relations and conceptual systems, which then can and must intervene, at a second stage, to work towards the knowledge of real concrete objects. To say that a theoretical knowledge, or theory in the strong sense, concerns formal abstract objects, concepts and theoretical conceptual systems means that it possesses the specific capacity to provide the theoretical instruments indispensable to the concrete knowledge of a whole series of possible real concrete objects. In having formal abstract objects for its object, theory in the strong sense thus bears on possible real objects, both on some current, present social formation or concrete situation, Lenin, here and now, but also on some other past or future social formation or concrete situation, in some other place, as long as those real objects do indeed come under the abstract concepts of the theory in question. Such is the difficulty of theory. We must never lose sight of the fact that, understood in a strong sense, theory is never reducible to the real examples invoked to illustrate it, since it goes beyond any given real object, since it concerns all possible real objects within the province of its concepts. The difficulty of theory in the strong sense derives, then, from the abstract and formal character not just of its concepts, but of its objects. To do Marxist theory in the strong sense, to define the fundamental theoretical principles of Marxism, is to work on abstract objects, to define abstract objects, for example, the following abstract objects: materialism, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, science, philosophy, dialectic, mode of production, relations of production, labor process, abstract labor, concrete labor, surplus value, the structure of the economic, the political, the ideological and theoretical mode of production, theoretical practice, theoretical formation, union of theory and practice, etc., etc. Naturally, the knowledge of formal abstract objects has nothing to do with a speculative and contemplative knowledge concerning pure ideas. On the contrary, it is solely concerned with real objects. It is meaningful solely because it allows the forging of theoretical instruments, formal and abstract theoretical concepts, which permit production of the knowledge of real concrete objects. Of course, this knowledge of formal abstract objects does not fall from the sky or from the human spirit. It is the product of a process of theoretical labor. It is subject to a material history, and includes among its determinate conditions and elements non-theoretical practices, economic, political and ideological, and their results. But, once produced and constituted, the formal theoretical objects can and must serve as the object of a theoretical labor in the strong sense, must be analyzed, thought and their necessity, their internal relations, and developed in order to draw from them all the consequences, that is, all their wealth. Marx provided us with an example of such work in Capital. There, an analysis of a formal abstract object, the capitalist mode of production, is used to develop all its forms, and to draw out all its consequences. It is because Marx accomplished this theoretical work, in the strong sense, i.e., produced knowledge of the formal abstract object that is the capitalist mode of production, of all its forms and consequences, that we can know what happens in real objects, social formations which fall under the capitalist mode of production. We must go still further. In working on the theoretical object capitalist mode of production, Marx also and at the same time worked on a more general theoretical object, the concept of mode of production. This permits us, in turn, to work on this object, then on other objects, knowledge of which the concept makes possible, modes of production other than the capitalist mode of production, the feudal mode of production, the socialist mode of production, etc., and even on an object required by Marx's thought, although he never arrived at it, the concept of theoretical mode of production and subsidiary concepts. This, on the condition that we know that in working on these other concepts of modes of production, we are still working on formal abstract objects. Such is the fundamental difficulty of theory, of any theoretical discourse, in the strong sense. Naturally, this difficulty offends common sense, because it introduces a paradoxical innovation, the idea that one can attain the knowledge of real concrete objects only on the condition of working also and at the same time on formal abstract objects. Therewith, this difficulty introduces the idea of a very specific form of existence, that of formal abstract objects, distinct from the form of existence of real concrete objects. It is not easy to grasp this idea, which is the very idea of theory in the strong sense. Above all, it is not easy to take this idea into account, practically and constantly, when reading a theoretical text. It requires a real effort to resist the temptations of empiricism, for which only real concrete objects exist, to adopt the critique of its ideological facts, genuinely to criticize them, and to situate oneself at the level of theory, i.e. of its formal abstract objects. See difficulty of theoretical method. Another difficulty specific to theory pertains not to its object but to the way in which it treats its object, that is, to its method. It is not enough, in fact, that a discourse treats a theoretical, formal abstract object for it to be called theoretical in the strong sense. A theoretical object can, for example, just as well be treated by an ideological or pedagogical discourse. What distinguishes these discourses is their mode of treating their theoretical object, their method. For example, a discourse like Stalin's little treatise on dialectical and historical materialism, which played a big role, since it taught Marxism to millions of militants over dozens of years, treats its object by a pedagogical method. It expounds the fundamental principles of Marxism, and in a generally correct manner. It offers the essential definitions, and above all makes the essential distinctions. It has the merit of being clear and simple, and thus accessible to the broad masses. But it exhibits the great defect of enumerating the principles of Marxism, without demonstrating the necessity of the order of exposition. Marx, that is, without demonstrating the internal necessity that links these principles, these concepts. Now the order of exposition, which connects these concepts to each other, pertains to their necessary relations, these relations to their very properties. This order constitutes their system, which gives its real meaning to each of the concepts. For example, if the distinction between Marxist science, historical materialism, and Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism, is clearly marked in Stalin's text, their internal relation and the specific necessity of their relation are not really thought through and demonstrated. For example, if the principles of materialism and of the dialectic are indeed affirmed, their internal, necessary relation is neither expounded nor demonstrated in its specific content. For practical, de facto reasons, a pedagogical method of exposition can assuredly leave certain of these relations, if not the necessary system that links the concepts and gives them their sense, in the shade. For de jure reasons, a theoretical method of exposition cannot do this. It must rigorously expound the necessity of these relations, that is its purpose. Marx was perfectly conscious of this in Capital, when he said that the method of exposition, as distinct from the method of investigation, or method of research and discovery, was an integral part of all scientific, we can add, and philosophical, discourse, that is, of all theoretical discourse. 7 The difficulty of a theoretical discourse in the strong sense derives, on the one hand, from the formal abstract nature of its object, and on the other, from the rigor of its order, that is, its method of exposition. What was said of the object must equally be said of the method. Like the object, it is necessarily formal abstract. Of course, this does not mean that a theoretical discourse must constantly remain at the level of theoretical abstraction alone. It can be illustrated by a great many possible concrete examples. Here again, Marx showed us the way in Capital. He continually illustrates his analysis of the capitalist mode of production with examples drawn from a real concrete object, the 19th-century British social formation. We have a perfect right to resort to this method of illustration, which is pedagogically sound and may play an important role in certain conditions. But we may do this only on the condition that we carefully distinguish the theoretical analysis of our theoretical, abstract, object from all its concrete illustrations, that we know that the object of theory in the strong sense cannot be reduced to, or confused with, the real objects used to illustrate it. If care is not taken to treat illustrations for what they are, illustrations only, and not concrete knowledges in the sense we have defined along with Marx, one risks falling into misunderstandings, like the celebrated misunderstanding to which many historians who read Capital fall victim. A historian looks for the concrete knowledge of a concrete object, some social formation in some conjuncture or in the dialectic of conjunctures that govern an entire period. Now Capital apparently contains some chapters of concrete history, on labor in England and the history of manufacture and industry, on primitive accumulation, etc. One may be tempted to see in this the Marxist theory of history at work in empirical concepts produced and displayed before our very eyes. Now if these chapters have so fascinated historians, it is precisely because they are not chapters of concrete Marxist history in the proper sense, it is because they bear a fraternal resemblance to the empirical chronological descriptions in which ordinary ideological history abounds. Marx does not in fact present them to us as chapters of a Marxist history, but as simple illustrations of theoretical concepts, the concepts of absolute and relative surplus value, and of the non-capitalist origin of capitalism. In these pseudo-chapters of concrete history, he confined himself to giving us what he had to, facts designed to illustrate, that is, to repeat an empirical reality, a concept, labor in England, or partial genealogies, the transition from primitive accumulation to large-scale industry. As has been powerfully demonstrated, these are elements for a concrete history, either materials or raw material for a Marxist history, but not chapters of Marxist history. If we want examples of concrete Marxist history, we must look for them where they are to be found, in Marx's historical works, the 18th Brumaire, etc., or in Lenin's historical analyses, the development of capitalism in Russia, etc., and the great political analyses from 1917 to 1922. On this condition, we will avoid the confusions between a concrete illustration of a theoretical concept and Marxist history. The final difficulty, the revolutionary novelty of the theory. To conclude this section on difficulties, we must offer yet another reason, the most important, for the difficulty of Marxist theoretical work. A theoretical text on Marx contains another difficulty besides that which pertains to the theoretical nature of its object or its method. This further difficulty is the revolutionary novelty of Marxist theory. We have seen what threatens the words used by a theoretical discourse. A rapid reading may construe them as having the same meaning they would possess in everyday life, when they actually have an entirely different meaning, that of theoretical concepts. We have seen what threatens the object of a theoretical discourse in the strong sense. A rapid reading can take this object as a real concrete object, when it actually possesses an entirely different nature, that of a formal abstract object. In these two cases, the specificity of theoretical language, terminology, and of the theoretical object is reduced and destroyed by the intervention of familiar obvious facts, those of everyday ideology, i.e., of empiricist ideology. We cannot have any illusions about this. It cannot be otherwise for Marxist theory. It is not only Marxist theory's sworn adversaries who loudly proclaim that it has contributed nothing new, it is also Marxism's partisans, when they read Marxist texts and interpret Marxist theory through the established self-evident truths, those of the reigning ideological theories. To take only two examples, Marxists who spontaneously, without difficulties, scruples, or hesitation, read and interpret Marxist theory within the schemes of evolutionism or humanism, in fact declare that Marx contributed nothing new, at least in philosophy and, by implication, in science, regarding the method of conceiving theoretical objects, and hence their structure. These Marxists reduce the prodigious philosophical novelty of Marx's thought to existing, ordinary, obvious forms of thought, that is, to forms of the dominant theoretical ideology. In order clearly to perceive and grasp the revolutionary novelty of Marxist philosophy and its scientific consequences, it is necessary lucidly to resist this ideological reduction, to combat the ideology that supports it, and to state what distinguishes the specificity of Marx's thought, what makes it a revolutionary thought, not only in politics, but also in theory. This is where the last difficulty resides. For it is not easy to break with the self-evident truths of theoretical ideologies like evolutionism or humanism, which have dominated all of Western thought for 200 years. It is not easy to say that Marx was not Hegelian. Hegelianism is the rich man's evolutionism, that Marx was not evolutionist, that Marx was not theoretically humanist. It is not easy to show positively how Marx, because he is neither Hegelian nor humanist, is something else entirely, something which must then be defined. And when one tries to show this, it is not easy to make it understood and have it acknowledged. Any theoretical text, however limited, that treats Marxist principles inevitably contains this fundamental difficulty. Unless we are going to cede to the false self-evidence of the dominant theoretical ideologies, whether evolutionism, humanism, or other forms of idealism, and thus betray the most precious aspect of Marx's thought, what makes it theoretically revolutionary, we must confront this difficulty, and struggle against the ideologies that continually threaten to suffocate, reduce and destroy Marxist thought. This is not an imaginary difficulty, it is an objective historical difficulty, as real in its way as the difficulties of revolutionary practice. The world does not undergo fundamental change easily, neither the social world, nor the world of thought. We know that a revolution is first of all required for the social world to change fundamentally. But after the revolution, it is further necessary to undertake an extremely long, arduous struggle, in politics and ideology, to establish and consolidate the new society, and make it prevail. The same goes for the world of thought. Following a theoretical revolution, another extremely long and arduous struggle is required, in theory and ideology, to establish the new thought, have it recognized and make it prevail, especially if a form of thought that founds a new ideology and a new political practice is involved. Prior to the success of this struggle, the revolution in society, like the revolution in thought, runs a very great risk of being smothered by the old world and, directly or indirectly, falling back under its sway. It will be understood why, again today, it would require a real effort to represent accurately the theoretical revolution accomplished by Marx in philosophy and in science, against the old ideologies that tend constantly to submit this revolution to their own law, that is, to smother and destroy it. This is why, although one certainly wants to take account of the bad reasons, errors, omissions, awkwardness and limits, any theoretical work will also have good reasons, inevitable and necessary reasons, for sometimes being difficult, reasons that pertain on the one hand to the theoretical nature of its object and its method, and on the other to the revolutionary novelty of Marx's thought. 2. Resources. But another question arises here. When we propose to attempt to define and expound the principles of Marxism, we do not claim to invent them but to resume them, to analyze and develop them. In order to be available for definition and exposition, these principles must already exist and be at our disposal, in some way or another. This condition seems obvious. We are reflecting on what Marx gave us. In order to speak of the principles of Marxist theory and practice, it seems sufficient, then, to obtain these principles from where they are to be found, in Marxist theory and Marxist practice. Yet this response, in its simplicity, poses a certain number of important problems, which touch on the very nature of the principles of Marxism. 1. We will first of all obtain Marxist principles where they are produced and set forth, in the theoretical works of Marx and his important disciples. Yet we need only know a little about these works to see that reading them immediately raises a certain number of difficulties. The first of these difficulties concerns the works of Marx himself. In fact, there are some very tangible theoretical differences between Marx's first works, the so-called philosophical or early works, and the later works, such as the Manifesto, the Poverty of Philosophy, the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Capital, etc. Similarly, there are tangible differences in object between these two groups of works. For example, Marx talks directly and at length about philosophy and ideology in the works of his youth and in the German ideology, but talks of these very little, if at all, in Capital. If we want to obtain some Marxist principles concerning philosophy or ideology, to which texts do we refer? To the texts that speak of these directly and explicitly, whatever their date, or to other, subsequent texts that have the great inconvenience of speaking very little, or not at all, about such concerns? To obtain the principles of Marxism from Marx, then, we must have posed and resolved this preliminary problem: which of Marx's texts can be taken as Marxist? In other words, we must have asked Marx himself a simple and perfectly natural question: from what moment, from which work, did Marx, who, like any bourgeois intellectual of the 1840s necessarily thought in the dominant, idealist, ideology, break with that ideology? At what moment did he lay the foundations of his revolutionary theory? It is evident that if we take the content and the letter of the texts prior to this rupture and this revolution as Marxist, for example, the idealist and humanist texts of his youth, we remain fascinated by the fetishism of the signature, and regress to a pre-Marxist position. It is not Marx's signature but Marx's thought, in the strong sense, which authenticates a text as Marxist. To identify the pre-Marxist and the Marxist texts, clearly to distinguish these two series of texts, this is a project that presupposes an entire labor of critique on Marx's work itself. This indispensable critical work has been commenced. Superscript 1. It must be understood that any discourse on Marxist theory presupposes this preliminary work of critique. If we take this preliminary work seriously, this implies that we are then able to answer a second question: can we derive certain Marxist principles from the Marxist works of Marx, for example Capital, even if these works do not directly or explicitly treat or state these principles? By what right, and via what procedures, may we do this? Let us consider, for example, the Marxist conception of philosophy. The question of philosophy abounds in the early works, and in the German ideology, but little, if anything, is said about it in Capital. If we know that the works of Marx's youth are not Marxist, we will not take their formulations on philosophy as Marxist, we will not be able to retain them. We will turn to Capital in search of what defines Marxist philosophy. Now, Capital does not give us the principles of Marxist philosophy in person, since it does not treat philosophy, the capitalist mode of production, not philosophy, is its object. Nevertheless, Marxist philosophy is very much present in Capital, which is a realization of it. We will say, then, that Marxist philosophy can be found there, because it is at work there. We will say that Marxist philosophy exists in Capital in the practical state, that it is present in the theoretical practice of Capital, to be precise, in the way the object of Capital is conceived, in the way its problems are posed, in the way they are treated and resolved. The expression in the practical state is not mislead us. In this case, the expression designates a mode of existence of philosophy in a scientific work, in a theoretical practice, thus a theoretical mode of existence, and not, something we shall encounter shortly, a mode of existence in a political and historical work, hence practical in the usual sense of the term. The existence of Marxist philosophy in the practical state in Capital designates the particular modality of the existence of the object, the problems, the scientific and thus theoretical method, of Capital. To say that Marxist philosophy is found in a practical state in Capital signifies, then, that the content of Marxist philosophy is indeed present in Capital, but that it lacks its theoretical form. Dialectical materialism, Marxist philosophy, is not dealt with there in its own right, as a distinct entity independent of historical materialism, science of history, but in, by, and through this chapter of historical materialism, which analyzes the essence of the capitalist mode of production. It is the existence of Marxist philosophy in the practical state in capital that authorizes us to derive the Marxist conception of philosophy from capital. If Marxist philosophy were not present in capital, we could not derive it therefrom. If it were present there, not only in its content but also in its form, spelled out explicitly, we would not need to derive it. Since it is present therein in the practical state, content, but not in the theoretical state, form, we must endow its content with its proper form. To do that we must identify its content, and give it its corresponding form. This work is a real theoretical work, not merely a work of simple extraction, abstraction in the empiricist sense, but a work of elaboration, transformation and production, which requires considerable effort. At least we can carry out this work, once we know that Marxist philosophy can really exist, in actuality, in the practical state, independently of its form and thus of its theoretical formulation. And when we affirm this possibility, we should know that we are affirming not only a fact, it is thus, but a fundamental principle of Marxism itself, a principle that ultimately concerns the relation between a philosophy and a science, the relation between theory and practice, the principle which holds that philosophy exists first of all in the practice of the sciences, before existing for itself. Everyone will understand that what has just been said regarding the principles of Marxist philosophy applies to a great many other principles of Marxism. We often find ourselves obliged to derive them, by a protracted labor of theoretical elaboration, transformation and production, from the practical state in which they are given to us in the texts of Marx and his successors. What applies to certain essential principles, for example philosophy, the union of theory and practice, etc., obviously applies, a fortiori, to their consequences. Marx did not say everything, not only because he did not have the time, but because to say everything makes no sense for a scientist. Only a religion can pretend to say everything. On the contrary, a scientific theory, by definition, always has something else to say, since it exists only in order to discover, in the very solution of problems, as many, if not more, problems than it resolves. Thus, in order to define certain Marxist concepts and their consequences, we will often have to derive them from the works of Marx and his successors, and to extend their effects by a complex labor of theoretical elaboration and production. This indispensable and difficult work has been begun elsewhere, in a rudimentary and imperfect form. Superscript 1, but we must understand that any discourse on Marxist theory presupposes this work, without which we would go no further than resetting and rededicating the foundation stone, Lenin superscript 1 square laid by Marx. Of course, and this is an absolutely determinate remark, we are not alone before Marx's works, and before capital. The work of elaboration to which I have just alluded has been underway for a long time, and its results are to be found in the theoretical works of Marx's main disciples. For example, we find something in Engels and Lenin that explicitly and directly takes up certain of the principles which are found only in the practical state in capital. Anti-Dühring, the dialectics of nature, and materialism and empirio-criticism allow us to pose in much more explicit terms the problem of the nature of Marxist philosophy, of the relation between theory and practice, etc., that remained implicit in capital. The same applies to other principles pertaining to historical materialism, for example the concept of social formation, the concept of the combination of several modes of production in every social formation. Lenin formulated these, deriving them from Marx through a rigorous theoretical examination, etc. Any work on Marxist theory must commence by carefully identifying and recording the results we owe to Marx and to his successors, and furthering this effort within the objective and subjective limits of possibility. Of course, we must apply the same method of theoretical extraction or elaboration to the works of Marx's successors. We will thus come to derive such and such theoretical elements present in the practical state in these works, in order to impart an adequate theoretical form to their theoretical content. It will be understood that this work, if it is not a simple extraction, but a genuine elaboration, is rarely limited to the production of a made-to-order form, just the right match for ready and waiting content. To believe that it is simply a matter of identifying an already adequate content, in order then to provide it with the appropriate form, as one chooses a suit according to the size of a customer, is insufficient. There is no pure content. Any content is always already given in a certain form. To give an adequate form to a theoretical content existing in a practical state almost always presupposes, then, two conjoint operations, the critical rectification of the old form and the production of the new, in one and the same process. This means that the production of the new, more adequate, theoretical form presupposes the critique of the old, the perception of its inadequacy and of the reasons for that inadequacy. This means that a work of theoretical elaboration, even one bearing on theoretical contents existing in a theoretical discourse in the practical state, presupposes a critical rectification of what is given in the practical state. There is nothing surprising about this. This is how any theoretical discipline proceeds in its development. A science or philosophy that is new, even revolutionary, always begins somewhere, in a certain universe of extant, and thus historically and theoretically determined, concepts and words. It is by means of the available concepts and terms that any new, even revolutionary, theory must find what it requires in order to think and express its radical novelty. Even in order to think against the content of the old universe of thought, any new theory is condemned to think its new content in certain of the forms of the existing theoretical universe which it is going to overturn. Neither Marx nor his successors escaped this condition, which governs the dialectic of all theoretical production. This is why we have not only to remove the pre-Marxist content of the thought of the young Marx, but also to criticize, in the name of the logic and coherence of the system of Marxist principles, certain of the forms in which the new content is presented. Evidently, this rule also applies to certain forms of existence of Marxist theoretical principles in the practical state in the mature works of Marx and his successors. This is why any production of an adequate form for a theoretical content in the practical state is in fact, at the same time, a critical rectification of the old form, wherein this content existed in the practical state. The important thing to grasp here is that this operation of critical rectification is not imposed from without on the works of Marx and his successors, but results from the application of these works to themselves. Very specifically, it results from the application of their more elaborated forms to their less elaborated forms, or, if one prefers, of their more elaborated concepts to their less elaborated concepts, or again, of their theoretical system to certain terms of their discourse, etc. This operation reveals some blanks, plays on words, lacunae, inadequacies, which rectification can then reduce. All this work proceeds concurrently. It is by bringing to light the most elaborated forms and concepts, the theoretical system, etc., that rectification can be carried out, and it is rectification that foregrounds forms, concepts and systems which determine its objects. Is it necessary to give some examples? It is the application of the conceptual system of capital to the conceptual system of the young Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts that makes visible the theoretical break between the two texts. It is in this way, to be quite precise, by the application of the concept of wage labor, which figures in Capital, to the concept of alienated labor, which figures in the Paris manuscripts, that the ideological, non-scientific character of the concept of alienated labor and thus of the concept of alienation that supports it, becomes visible. In the same way, within Capital itself, it is by the application of the well-defined concepts of labor process, labor power, concrete labor, abstract labor, wage labor, etc., to the concept of labor, also found in Capital, that one discovers this concept of labor, by itself, to be, in Capital, only a word, one of the old forms belonging to the conceptual system of classical political economy and Hegelian philosophy. Marx made use of it, but to lead to some new concepts which, in Capital itself, render this form superfluous and constitute its critique. It is extremely important to know this in order to avoid taking this word, labor, for a Marxist concept, otherwise, as many current examples attest, one may be tempted to erect upon it all the idealist and spiritualistic interpretations of Marxism as philosophy of labor, of the creation of man by man, of humanism, etc. Such, then, is the first response that can be given to the question, where are we to obtain the principles of Marxism? From the theoretical works of Marx and his successors. On condition, first of all, of having accurately identified those works of Marx that are Marxist. On condition, next, of knowing that Marxist principles can be given to us in those works either in person, in an adequate theoretical form, or in another form, in the practical state. On condition, finally, of knowing that to derive certain of the principles of Marxism from the works of Marx and his successors, especially when those principles are there in the practical state, presupposes an elaboration that must sometimes take the form of a work of critical rectification. 2. All this, however, concerns only the theoretical works among the classics of Marxism. We must now speak of something else, the practical works of Marxism, that is, the political practice of the organizations of class struggle born of the union of Marxist theory and the workers' movement, and its results. We have shown that Marxist principles can exist in the practical state and the theoretical works of Marxism. Now it must be shown that they can also exist in the practical state in the practical works of Marxism. The political practice of communist parties can in fact contain, in the practical state, certain Marxist principles, or certain of their theoretical consequences, which are not to be found in existing theoretical analyses. From the viewpoint of the theoretical content itself, the political practice of organizations of class struggle can thus find itself, in certain cases and on certain points, and sometimes very considerably, in advance of existing theory. One can then derive, from the political practice that contains them, theoretical elements in advance of the state of existing theory. Of course, it is not a matter of just any spontaneous practice, but of the practice of revolutionary parties that base their organization and their action on Marxist theory. Of course, it is not a matter of just any of these practices based on Marxist theory, but of a practice whose relation to Marxist theory is correct. Superscript 1 cubed. With this dual qualification in mind, the political practice of a revolutionary party, the structure of its organization, its objectives, the forms of its action, its leadership of the class struggle, its historical achievements, etc., constitute the realization of Marxist theory in determinate real concrete conditions. As these principles are theoretical, if this realization is correct, it inevitably produces results of theoretical value. Among these results, some simply represent the application of theoretical principles already known and stated by theory, others, by contrast, can represent theoretical elements, some new theoretical effects or even principles, that do not figure in the actual state of theory. Under the conditions just mentioned, it is in this way that the political practice of revolutionary Marxist parties can contain, in the practical state, theoretical elements, effects, or principles in advance of existing theory. This is why, to the question, where do we find the principles of Marxism? We can answer, at once in the theoretical works or the classics of Marxism, and in the practical works of the communist parties. Let us clarify what it is meant by the practical works or political practice of communist parties. These can be political analyses of the concrete situation, resolutions fixing the party line, political discourses defining it and commenting on it, programmatic slogans recording political decisions or drawing out their conclusions. These can be actions undertaken, the way they are conducted as well as the results obtained. These can be forms of organization of the class struggle, the distinction between its different levels and between the corresponding different organizations. These can be methods of leadership of the class struggle and of the union with the masses, the way problems of the union of theory and practice in the party, between the leadership and the base, between the party and the masses, etc., are resolved. These are so many forms of the political practice of the communist parties. It is these forms that may contain, in the practical state, new theoretical elements or effects, which can realize and thus produce principles as yet absent from theory itself. These new theoretical elements must be sought not only in analyses, decisions, political discourses or actions undertaken, but also in the forms of organization, and in the methods of leadership of the class struggle. Let us take an example. It is normal to look for the development of the theoretical principles of Marxism in the theoretical works of Lenin. Everyone knows what Lenin contributed to the working class movement with his theory of imperialism. Yet he contributed still more. And if we wish to identify the most important theoretical events produced since Marx and Engels, we must look not so much in Lenin's theoretical texts as in his political texts. Lenin's deepest and most fertile theoretical discoveries are contained, above all, in his political texts, in what constitutes, then, the resume of his political practice. To take only one example, Lenin's political texts, analyses of the situation and its variations, decisions taken and analyses of their effects, etc., give us, with dazzling insistence, in the practical state, a theoretical concept of capital importance, the concept of the present moment or conjuncture. This concept, or principle, produced by Lenin in the activity of a Marxist party, in order to lead its struggle, is an absolutely fundamental Marxist principle, not only for historical materialism but also, as will be shown below, for dialectical materialism, yet it did not explicitly figure in existing Marxist theory. Only a little attention is needed to grasp the decisive import of this new theoretical concept. Not only does it retrospectively cast light on the distinctiveness of the Marxist theory of history, on the forms of variation and dominance within the social structure on the basis of determination in the last instance by the economic, and thus on historical periodization, that cross of the historians. Not only does it for the first time permit the enunciation of a theory, that is, a genuine conceptualization, of the possibility of political action, detached at last from the false antinomies of freedom and necessity, the play of the variations in dominance in the conjuncture, and of the real conditions of political practice, in designating its object, the balance of class forces engaged in the struggle of the present moment. Not only does it allow us to think the articulation of the different instances whose combination of overdetermined effects can be read in the conjuncture, but it also allows us to pose, in a concrete manner, the problem of the union of theory and practice, that is, one of the most profound questions of dialectical materialism, not only in the domain of political practice but also in the domain of theoretical practice, for, in its relation with the non-theoretical, and especially the political, conjuncture, the theoretical conjuncture defines the link that allows us to think, in the necessity of its play, the nature of theoretical practice. That a principle of such theoretical fecundity and importance was contained in the practical state in Lenin's political analyses and interventions from 1917 to 1923 is an incontestable fact. That this principle remained in a practical state, no one being sufficiently advised to derive it from Lenin's political works, is, unfortunately, also a fact. A theoretical treasure was there, within reach, in Lenin's political works. No one discovered it, and it remained sterile. Even the officially proclaimed primacy of practice, and of political practice, did not inspire systematic research on Lenin's political works. There have certainly been important lessons drawn from them in the practice of the communist parties. But, leaving aside Stalin's questions of Leninism, no systematic theoretical work was derived, bearing on Lenin's political principles. Moreover, there has been no systematic theoretical work drawn from Lenin's political practice, bearing on the theoretical concepts of historical materialism and dialectical materialism and thus on the important theoretical, even philosophical, discoveries produced by Lenin's political practice. In the same way, a number of theoretical concepts remained in the practical state in the works of Marx himself. To what do we owe this regrettable situation, whose effects can be painfully felt today? Without a doubt, to the urgency of the political tasks of the working class movement, which was not allowed the leisure of calm study by its class enemy. But also to the conception of Marxism constructed by intellectuals of the working class, cut off as they were either from its real practice or from the practice that produced its theory, and thus subject, despite their political loyalty, to bourgeois ideologies, empiricism, evolutionism, humanism, pragmatism, which they projected onto the great classical texts, as they did onto the great deeds of the working class movement. Be that as it may, this situation lays a precise task before us, to draw from Marx, from Lenin, and from the great communist leaders, not only what they said in their theoretical works, but also whatever these works contain in the practical state, as well as whatever their political works contain by way of theoretical discoveries. An urgent task. Thus, important theoretical events do not always or exclusively occur in theory. It happens that they also occur in politics, and that as a result, in certain of its sectors, political practice finds itself in advance of theory. It happens that theory does not take notice of these theoretical events, which occur outside its official, recognized field, even though they are decisive, in many respects, for its own development. Superscript 1 For if, to reprise an excellent formula, applied to Galileo by Georges Canguilhem, we declare that the peculiarity of theory is to speak the truth, dire le vrai, in the strong sense of the word, to isolate, define, state and demonstrate it with theoretical arguments, thus in a discourse subject, as Marx wished, to a rigorous order of exposition. We must note, at the same time, that one can be in the truth, être dans le vrai, without therewith being able to speak the truth. Superscript 1 This distinction may be understood in a very broad sense. One is in the truth not only when one tells it but also when one produces a theoretical content in the practical state, without at the same time producing its theoretical form, the form of its telling, or of its theoretical discourse. We have seen that one can thus be in the truth in theory itself, without in the same breath being able to speak the truth therein. It is thus that Marxist philosophy is found in the practical state in capital. Capital is indeed in Marxist philosophy, without also being able to speak it, without producing its rigorous discourse. We have just seen that one could thus be in the truth in political practice, without being able to speak this truth there, in the strong sense of theoretical discourse. This possibility of being in the truth without saying the truth, the distinction between a theoretical content in the practical state and a theoretical content in the theoretical state, all these propositions are not conveniences or devices of an expository rhetoric, they are propositions that directly concern Marxism itself, because they involve the relation of theory and practice. They affirm the primacy of practice in theory as well as in practice, and, most crucially, they also show us the variations of this relation, which can oscillate between the extremes of a false relation and a correct relation. Just because a new theoretical content can exist in the practical state in Marxist theory or in the practice of communist parties, it does not follow that everything existing there in the practical state has a theoretical value. It is not true that one is in the truth solely by virtue of the fact that one is in practice, just as it is not true that one is in the truth solely by virtue of the fact that one decides to speak it, that is, solely by virtue of the fact that one has a discourse with a theoretical appearance, or that one does theory. If this were true, all chatterboxes would be scientists, as Feuerbach said. One can do bad practice, just as one can do bad theory. In the practical as in the theoretical order, we have a renowned example, to which Lenin drew our attention, the theoretical and political revisionism of the Second International. But this example leaves us with a final theoretical problem. In the theoretical practice of Marxism, as in its political practice, what conditions must be observed to assure a correct union of theory and practice, that is, to assure this union against the deviations to which it is exposed? The answer to this question depends on a general theory of the union of theory and practice, both in the field of theoretical practice and in the field of political practice, and on a theory of the articulation of these two fields, This theory can be general only on condition that it includes the theory of the extreme limits of the variability of this union, false union, correct union. We are no longer bereft of the means with which to pose and resolve this difficult and urgent problem. We have at our disposal the entire experience of the ideological struggle, Engels's and Lenin's struggle against theoretical dogmatism and revisionism, and of the political struggle, against political dogmatism and revisionism, of the communist parties. There, again, we have at our disposal an experience that undoubtedly contains, in the practical state, historical protocols of the greatest theoretical import. We need only go to work. In this work, the resources far outweigh the difficulties. Sur le travail théorique. Difficult set resources, La Pensée 132, April 1967. Translated by James H. Kavanaugh. 3. Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists. Preface. This introduction to the philosophy course for scientists was delivered in October to November 1967 at the École Normale Supérieure. At that time I and a group of friends concerned with problems in the history of the sciences, and with the philosophical conflicts to which it gives rise, intrigued by ideological struggle and the forms it can take among the intellectuals of scientific practice, decided to address our colleagues in a series of public lectures. This experiment, inaugurated by the present exposition and continued by the interventions of Pierre Macherey, Etienne Balibar, François Regnault, Michel Pécheux, Michel Fint, and Alain Badiou, was to last up to the eve of the great events of 1968. The texts of the lectures were immediately mimeographed and soon began to circulate. Later, on the initiative of students, certain of them were even reproduced in the provinces, Nice, Nantes. From the beginning we had planned, perhaps precipitately, to publish the lectures. To this end, a series was created in the Theory Collection, and in 1969 the lectures by M. Pécheux and M. Fint, sur l'histoire des sciences, and by A. Badiou, Le Concept de Modèle, appeared. For various reasons the other lectures, although announced, could not be published. It is in response to numerous requests that I have today, after a long delay, published my 1967 Introduction to Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists. With the exception of part of the first lecture and the critique of Jacques Monod, which I have reproduced unchanged, I have revised the remainder of the text to make more readable what was nothing more than a hasty improvisation, and also to develop certain formulae that had not been worked out and were often enigmatic. But I have, on the whole, been careful to respect the theoretical limitations of this essay, which should be read as a dated work. I am also publishing it as a retrospective testimony. In it may be found the initial formulations that inaugurated a turning point in our research on philosophy in general and Marxist philosophy in particular. Previously, in For Marx and Reading Capital, I had defined philosophy as the theory of theoretical practice. But in this course new formulae appear: philosophy, which has no object, in the sense that a science has an object, has stakes. Philosophy does not produce knowledges but states theses, etc. Its theses open the way to a correct position on the problems of scientific and political practice, etc. These formulae remain schematic and much work will be necessary to complete them and render them more precise. but at least they indicate an order of research the trace of which may be found in subsequent works. Louis Althusser, May 14, 1974. Lecture IR poster announced an introductory course